This episode of The Detail comes to you from guest presenter Connor McClay.
Fanáticos de Dragon Ball se dieron cita en la plancha del Zócalo de la Ciudad de México para realizar la última Genkidama, en honor al famoso Akira Toriyama.
Where do you even begin exploring a legacy as legendary as Akira Toriyama's?
The influence that Toriyama, I think, kind of Megan, as you said, the three of us wouldn't be here if not for Akira Toriyama.
Akira Toriyama died on March 1st at the young age of 68. If you haven't heard of him, that's okay. Many in the English-speaking world haven't. But even if you aren't directly a fan of the artist's work, you have almost certainly felt his touch on the things you watch, read, and play. The vast cultural engine of Japan has a great reach, and when one of its greatest champions passes on, it's worth paying attention to.
Connor McClay, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Mum.
That disclaimer was going to come at the end, but okay, fine. All right, I found Connor in a basement at my house, and he suggested that we do this podcast because even though it's huge in certain parts of the world, it's something that goes over a lot of people's heads. So let's just start with the basics. What is anime?
Anime is animation coming from Japan in a very distinctive style, and don't ask whether that style is what anime is or whether anime is defined as coming from Japan, because that's a whole other debate.
So we're talking about things like Dragon Ball Z.
Absolutely, that's the topic of the hour, in fact. Akira Toriyama made Dragon Ball Z and has been hugely influential over it.
And what about manga? What's the difference between anime and manga?
Format. Manga is simply written. It's drawn. Manga is comics to anime's animation.
Well, how big is it?
Huge. It's massive. I mean, it's obviously massive within Japan, but we wouldn't be talking about it if it hadn't gone all around the world.
What else would we not suspect has its origins in Akira Toriyama's work?
Oh, so much stuff. In 2019, Robert Rodriguez and James Cameron made Alita Battle Angel. That is literally just a manga. There have been more direct adaptations. There was a awful adaptation of Dragon Ball Z called Dragon Ball Evolution. The Wachowskis, huge anime fans.
This is the Wachowskis of Matrix fan.
Whoa. The Matrix is... They literally showed their producer Ghost in the Shell and said, we want to do that, but in real life.
When Akira Toriyama died, what was the reaction from your world of the basement internet?
Overwhelming. It's all that anyone can talk about. First of all, the other huge figures in the industry have been going on about it. I said that he's influenced shonen that has happened since, but some of the biggest series creators are more vocal about it than others. The One Piece author of the highest-selling manga of all time, ever.
Oh, I know about One Piece because Stephen Adams loves it.
Yes. Stephen Adams said in an interview...
Did you get a chance to watch any games like Spurs Warriors?
No, I was watching cartoons, man. some Japanese anime. I don't know if you watch that. That's my stuff. One Piece. One Piece, it's about pirates and that. You won't, don't worry. One Punch Man as well, another classic. But yeah.
Which many people relate to, which is just one of many examples of how what was once a kind of niche area of culture entertainment is very much leaking into the mainstream. The author of One Piece, Oda, has said many times that he's directly influenced by Akira Toriyama and his work. And you can see it. It's very clear.
Why are Western kids like you hooked on this stuff?
Oh, there's a lot of reasons. It was the only thing like it when it came out. We saw it on TV, and we'd never seen anything else like it. And it was big explosions, and holy crap, it's this overpowered character who's blowing up mountains with his bare hands. And
I do remember the Kamehameha bit.
Like, Kamehameha is a really simple pose. It's a wide stance. You do this thing and you push your hands out like that. And a big reason why it became so mimetic is because it's very easy to just do. And kids sitting in front of a TV screen on Saturday morning would see Goku do a Kamehameha and try to do it themselves.
Every artist wishes they could one day make something as impactful as Dragon Ball. Akira Toriyama's martial arts magnum opus defined a genre, influenced several entire generations, and created a truly iconic cast of characters who will endure in popular culture for decades to come.
Allow me to introduce Dr. Emerald King, Lecturer of Humanities, Global Cultures and Languages at the University of Tasmania and award-winning cosplayer. Welcome to The Detail.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
So, I am trained in Japanese literature, and then in a terrible example of not letting your private life become a research area, I fell into cosplay, and I've been cosplaying since 2007 in Australia, New Zealand, and in Japan. And this year I will be traveling to Japan in August as part of my research, of course, to represent Australia at the World Cosplay Summit.
Congratulations. So before we confuse the listeners too much, the world of manga, broadly speaking, what is it and what's the difference between the English-speaking equivalent?
The easiest way to explain the difference between a Japanese manga and, say, Marvel or DC Comics comes down to marketing terms and also artistic style. In American comics, so Marvel, DC are probably the big names that people are familiar with. Everything is done by a studio with a team of either contract workers or in-house artists. So you'll have a writer, you'll have an inker, you'll have somebody who does pencils, you'll have somebody who does colors, you'll have a letterist. Everything is kind of siloed out into bit parts. Traditionally in Japan, everything is done by the manga artist. There are also, of course, stylistic differences and linguistic differences. So because Japanese is read or can be read top to bottom, right to left, that also influences the way that panels are laid out and also the way that stories are told. And then the other big difference that we have between manga and comics is that in manga we have a lot more diversity in the various types of manga that are for sale. In Japan, everybody reads manga, everybody reads comics, and there are things at all age levels. So there are things for people who are just starting to read, business manuals, policy documents, all available in manga form. So we have educational manga, long-running sports series. We have what's known as shoujo or girls comics aimed at a 12 to mid-20s readership, predominantly female. But again, this is a marketing term. So there's cross-readership. And then we have shonen manga, which I suspect is what we're going to end up talking a lot about today, which is, again, aimed predominantly at a boy readership, so 10s to late teens. And that's probably what we are most familiar with in the West, because that is what is seen as globally more successful. And so it's more translated into languages other than Japanese. And of course, it is the home of manga heavyweights such as Akira Toriyama.
Akira Toriyama. Obviously, like you said, a big heavyweight, huge in the world of manga. If you had to compare him to someone who's had an equivalent impact in the West, just to give us a frame of reference, where would you place him?
Look, I think you could get away with saying that the myth that's built around people like Toriyama and the kind of the big Shonen Jump 3. So Toriyama's work, of course, Dragon Ball, One Piece, which has just had a Netflix adaptation, and Naruto. The influence that those three series had would be akin to the kind of influence that's attributed to people like Stan Lee.
You know, I guess one person can make a difference.
Shonen Jump became an absolute titan in its field, and it comes back to its original ethos. When the comic series first came out, the attitude was no losers. All of the heroes and characters featured in these particular stories even if they're the underdog, even if they're downtrodden, they get back up again, they dust themselves off. None of them are losers. Everybody has some kind of worth. And then that's used to encourage the readers to find their own self-worth. And, it's even gone so far as to start mentioning and dealing with issues of things like mental health.
That sounds quite similar to the equivalent in the West, superheroes. Would you say that one influenced the other, or is this just parallel evolution? Did we come up with these ideas independently?
There is a long-running debate in scholars as to who influenced who. Did Osamu Tezuka steal from Disney, or did Disney steal from Osamu Tezuka? And I feel like that's a bit of a chicken-egg situation. All of these artists, any artist in Japan, has been influenced by people from the West, and likewise, most artists working in visual medium have been influenced by Japan right from the late 1800s upwards. If we go back to the work of Monet and Toulouse-Lautrec, and the Japonoiserie movements, there is a strong influence, particularly in line style, that would then go on to change how political comics and punch comics were drawn. And then that, of course, evolved into superhero comics that we know and love today.
So this whole intermingling of cultures between the West and Japan, this isn't a new thing. This has been going on since the beginning.
This has been going on since Japan was forcibly opened in the late 1800s. And we have records of interaction between trade way back to Elizabethan times. And then the country closed itself off for a period of time. And that's where we have all of our mythic, legendary samurai stuff happening. But there are these conversations that have been happening. There are influences that you can find and trace. Is that too broad to be helpful? Probably yes. But we're lucky because we have artists who go on record and say, hey, I was growing up and I watched Astro Boy and that really influenced my line style, or I was growing up and I really loved Captain America comic books, and so I wanted to do something like that, but for the audience that I grew up with.
Speaking of influence, back to Akira Toriyama, obviously a huge legacy. What did he influence? What kind of impact has he had on the world of manga and, by extension, the world of Japanese culture and world culture?
I'm going to take a niche topic and make it even more niche because that's what academics do. I think, broadly speaking, the series is probably one of the most well-known in Anglophone countries. When you talk about anime, a lot of people will respond, oh, yeah, Dragon Ball, yeah, Kamehameha. And I was actually at an event earlier in the month that occurred just after the news had broken of Toriyama's passing, and there was a memorial group, Kamehameha. So for those who aren't familiar with Dragon Ball, that's one of the ways of powering up an energy ball that can then be hurled at an opponent with the release of ki on the ha. It's influential for a number of reasons. If we trace it back to the original storyline, it's actually the story of monkey magic, which everybody in New Zealand and Australia, I would say in their late 30s to early 40s, will remember fondly. And then the story just continues from there. It's influential in its storytelling medium because it is one of the series that really changes how characters level up, how they get more powerful and what they do with that power and the consequences of having power. It develops into a much more serious series as it progresses and as different issues are tackled. And of course, Toriyama at one point walks away from the series. He feels like he's completed it, like it's finished. And then we get the disastrous
the movie that shall not be named.
Admittedly, when I watched the movie, it was a group of friends.
Dragon Ball Evolution, just to be clear for anyone.
Dragon Ball Evolutions. Watched it with a group of friends. I don't actually know what happened in the film because they were too busy mocking it mercilessly. Toriyama was so disappointed with it that he actually came back to the series. He saw it and felt that his work wasn't done because obviously the producers of that particular film hadn't been able to capture the essence, and Toriyama felt that that was a lack. So, we have that to be grateful for.
And did others follow in his footsteps with Dragon Ball? How has Dragon Ball influenced other shonen writers since then?
And I feel like there are definitely crossovers, as you know, as I said, the big three of Naruto, One Piece, and Dragon Ball.
Because I'm passingly familiar with Naruto and One Piece, obviously, and there's a lot in those series that distinctly remind me of Dragon Ball. I mean, they've both got protagonists who eat a lot and are a kind of numbskulled, but are very sort of dedicated to their friends and family and whatnot. Is that influence? Did they come from Goku, essentially?
I feel like there are overlaps between all of them. Again, it comes back to our kind of chicken egg question of which came first and who influenced who. Interestingly, in the kind of 70s, 80s, we do have a lot of manga artists living together. We have them almost forming little communities around certain areas. These are not artists who are working in isolation. They would have been talking with each other. They may have been rivals. They may have been best friends. So there are conversations that are happening on the page and also off the page.
Talking about the industry in general and its reach specifically, is this getting stronger outside of Japan? Would you say that this niche topic is becoming less niche in the West?
I definitely think so. I know that I just turned 40, and when I was growing up, we would watch things like Astro Boy and Lost Cities of Gold, and as kids, we didn't know that these were anything but Saturday morning cartoons, right? But coming back to them in the early 2000s, coming back to them as an academic, you realize that there is something different happening here. I feel like with the access that younger generations have to anime and manga, the knowledge that they have, the fact that they don't have to buy bootleg VHS from Hong Kong or America, the fact that they can stream things instantly or read comics or have access to things like the Shonen Jump online services directly. I feel like these things have become much more normalized from a younger age, whereas definitely for an older readership, they were something very niche that you actually had to go out and search actively for.
So with the ease of access, do you predict that it's going to intermingle further, that this is going to continue?
It's something that we're already seeing at pop culture events. And initially what we see at pop culture events, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, is very much a separation of this is a Japan event, this is a gaming event, this is a Western event. And a lot of those lines are not as harsh as they used to be. So, I have seen Spider-Man cosplayers at Overload. I've dressed as anime characters at Armageddon. So I think within those kind of fandom spaces, that breakdown is already happening. And I feel like with the availability in the mainstream, that these kind of things will also become not taken for granted, but it'll just be like a thing that you watch on it's more commonplace. That's a wonderful word. Thank you.
Is this coming back to Japan and influencing what they're making in Japan?
Definitely. So anytime we have a piece of media that's translated, that's always a two-way conversation. If we look at things, I've mentioned Disney a couple of times, Tokyo Disneyland and Disney Sea are constantly rated the best Disney parks in the world. We have a lot of Disney media that is released in Japan only. We have global releases of MCU films. So all of these products are being translated into Japanese. There is a market for them.
Throughout all of this, through this great blending of cultures and this massive exporting, how has Japan managed to keep a hold of its own cultural identity so securely?
That is a question that I feel a lot of Japanese studies scholars, both in Japan and outside of Japan, have actually tackled with. Because we do have a lot of globalization, we have a lot of glocalization that takes place in Japan. There is in Japan a notion that Japan is special and separate. It is a very literary nation, so it likes print things, it likes things that are related to stories. If we think about the platform formerly known as Twitter, Japanese is the second most commonly used language on that platform, which is incredible if you think that the first one is English, which is used by multiple countries, and Japanese is predominantly used by a single country. So that kind of gives you an idea of how much stuff is being published and being produced. And Japan particularly the Japanese government, but also various institutions, work hard to preserve this kind of identity. So you'll often hear things like Japan is a country with 4 seasons, which is unique to Japan, of course. Incredibly special. In spring, the cherry blossoms blossom, and in autumn, the autumn leaves fall. And this is unique and special to Japan. Which, of course, it's not, but that's the kind of packaging and the kind of identifying characteristics that are happening. So in a lot of ways, we have an industry that works at producing Japan for both the Japanese, but also for the global market.
So it's pride then, largely. It's a pride in their own national identity that keeps it solid and secure.
That could be one way to talk about it. Of course, whenever we start talking about nationalism, we need to be careful because we have very real-world examples of where certain types of nationalistic fervour can lead us. But yeah, there is a certain amount of pride there and a certain amount of, I think, almost pleasure that's being taken in the Japanese identity and having something special. I have a friend who comes from a calligraphy dynasty, and her line of working calligraphers who have made things for various temples. Actually, she's from Aichi, from Nagoya Prefecture, which is also where Akira Toriyama was born. So there's that connection. But, the family has been working for longer than the white civilization has been in Australia. So there's also a very long weight of history and culture that can help to cement a country's identity.
So the mimetic nature, I guess, of Japanese culture around the world is something they take pleasure in, rather than feeling any kind of despair at the dilution of the medium.
Yeah, more often than not, people in Japan are, they're quite chuffed when they see that things like Hello Kitty or Dragon Ball or Japanese versions of various sweets or kimono are popular outside of Japan. It's something that they're very chuffed about. Now, of course, obviously, I'm not a Japanese person. I'm a Japanese studies expert, and I'm not a member of the Japanese diaspora. And so once we start taking diaspora into account, some of those notions will change, and we might think back to the early 2010s where there was a lot of talk online about things like appropriation and how to appropriate appropriately. But I think for the most part, yeah, there is a sense of pride. There is a sense of joy that other people are seeing something in Japan and enjoying it. In the 2010s, there was a scholar working out of, I believe, Christchurch, and she was studying rugby teams who had named themselves after Dragon Ball characters. And the idea of the various families, the various zoku that we see in Dragon Ball really linked to their notions of whānau. And so a couple of regional rugby teams, and they were forging their identity both from their Māori heritage, from their New Zealand heritage with that inbuilt love of rugby, and also from Dragon Ball. I just think it's so cool to have all of those areas coming together.
That's it for today. The Detail is supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Phil Benge and produced by Alexia Russell. I'm Connor McClay. Thank you very much to Dr. Emerald King, and thank you for listening.